Good morning and welcome to Renew Canada's InfraIntelligence series. My name is Corinne Lynds and I'm the content director here at Actual Media. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion on building retrofits into renewal cycles. Before we get started, I'd like to thank PCL for sponsoring this webinar, and I'd like to give you a quick tour of the Crowdcast platform so you're able to get as much great information as possible out of today's session. By now, you've probably noticed a few of us checking in there on the right-hand side with the chat feature. Please say hello, let us know who you are, where you're from. We are Canadians, we always appreciate report on the weather. Right above the chat, you'll see an Actual Media icon. If you click follow, you'll continue to be updated on our InfraIntelligence series as new webinars are announced. Down below, you'll see a variety of information. You'll see the polls feature, where we encourage you to cast your votes. You'll see a little green button with rotating links to the speakers' websites, so you can check those out as well. Most importantly is the Ask a Question feature, so please don't be shy about becoming part of the conversation. I'll do my best to pose our questions to the panelists throughout the discussion, where it makes the most sense. And I can point out now that this is the last InfraIntelligence webinar of 2022. We've had a great year hosting discussions and bringing together experts to talk about all kinds of great topics. We've talked about public infrastructure on all kinds of levels. We've talked about disaster resilience. We've talked about public transit. We've talked about expanding capacity at several of Canada's busiest ports. We've talked about harnessing green energy. We've talked about healthcare. And we've got yet another great panel discussion lined up for you today. If you've missed any of those webinars, you can access recordings on Renew Canada's events page at renewcanada.net. All right, so we have an impressive lineup of speakers joining us today. But before I jump in and introduce them, I'd like to take a few moments to acknowledge the many First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada as the original stewards of this great country. I'm here in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We all share in the responsibility of our natural infrastructure, and there's much we can learn from the traditional knowledge of the land, water, and materials that allow us to build projects that benefit all Canadians. All right, so let's meet our experts. I'm going to begin by inviting each of our panelists to the screen. Once they're all on screen, I'll have them spend just a couple minutes to introduce themselves quickly and tell us about where they're from, what their role is, and what perspective they're bringing to today's discussion. First up, we have Mike Wieninger from PCL Construction. We'll just give Mike a second to get up here on screen. There he is. Hello, Mike. Then we have Devon from the City of Toronto. Here he comes. Beautiful. And then we have Shannon Giebelhaus who's our energy advisor. Come on up, Shannon. There she is. We have Kirk Johnson, Eco-Efficiency Consulting. And that, I think, there they all are. Perfect. All right. Mike, I'm going to get you to kick us off. So introduce yourself, who you are, where you're from, and what perspective you're bringing to today's discussion.
Great. Well, thank you, Corinne, and very much appreciate the invitation to be part of this webinar. I'm Mike Wieninger, COO Canadian Operations for PCL Construction. Just been with the company for 26 years, so PCL is the largest contractor in Canada, coast to coast. And so the perspective I'm bringing today is from the general contractor's perspective and the building perspective.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mike. All right, Devon, you're up next.
Great. Devon Stops. I'm a senior engineer with the City of Toronto. I have a pretty diverse background. I have a degree in engineering physics, and I've worked in everything from heavy civil construction to finance to energy efficiency. With the city, I work with how do we get the community of buildings across the city to net zero. So we run a few programs related to financing projects, related to providing guidance, and really excited to be here talking about our strategy for how we get there.
Great. Thank you, Devon. All right, Shannon, you're up.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shannon Giebelhaus. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta, and I'm an energy advisor with Natural Resources Canada. My background is actually alternative energy technologies. I graduated from NAIT in 2013. And I've also had a bit of a diverse background, also doing agriculture on small scale. So what I'm bringing to this conversation is, I guess, I'm a younger professional in this industry, and I've seen, even within the last 10 years, a lot of change in the environment here. And I'm really looking forward to bring my passion to this conversation, as well as what I've seen as an energy advisor in the last couple of years.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, Kirk, you're up.
Hi, I'm Kirk. Are you guys getting a reverb there?
We are.
All right. Let's try that again. All right. Hi, I'm Kirk Johnson, and I'm with Eco Efficiency Consulting. I've been doing market transformation and program design for over 15 years, working across Canada for funders and companies like City of Toronto, Canada Green Building Council, doing about $300 million of decarbonization, incentives and policy, things like Toronto Green Standard, Energy Star multifamily. And right now I'm focused on workforce development and market transformation, working with people like University of Waterloo, and focused on working with people like Efficiency Canada to help bring out market transformation and decarbonization.
Great. Thank you, everyone. All right, so we have so much good stuff to talk about today. Let's not waste any time. We'll dive right in. So for Canada to achieve its 2030 and 2050 climate targets, building owners and operators are going to need to upgrade, retrofit, ultimately decarbonize hundreds of millions of square meters of space. When it comes to decarbonizing buildings, what are some of the barriers to implementing carbon retrofits from the perspective of the owners and policymakers? I know, Devon, we talked a little bit about this in our test session earlier this week, so I'm going to kick it over to you to start.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'd say first and foremost, the two biggest barriers are you have to have some sort of clean energy source to heat your building space and water. So when you're talking about the potential sources of energy, it all comes back to clean electricity. So first and foremost, we need a grid that is producing clean electricity in order to move that to a building that is going to be efficient and clean. So you're talking about electric heat pump technology then in the building to efficiently use that electricity. We're talking about using, again, clean electricity. It could be local solar, it could be hydropower on the grid, like we have so much of in Ontario. But that's the biggest barrier. Moving on from that, you get a lot of other barriers as well. Cost is probably the next biggest barrier. Well, all of these measures are technically feasible using the technology we have today. They're very costly. Even when you're looking at the life cycle costs for a building, they're still beyond the price of carbon. So it could be a big struggle to implement.
Fair enough. All right. Who would like to jump in next? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the other big barriers or challenges is just the logistics of being able to do it. So, picture an occupied residential building. At what point can you make those important, say, transformational projects happen when you got occupied spaces, certainly in a residential tower. So I think it's very challenging, and because in the best case scenario is that it's empty, and that's the best time to do it in a quick fashion. But in many cases, you don't have that opportunity, or it's a massive cost, as Devon mentioned, if you were to vacate the entire building.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd say maybe talking about residential towers in particular, I think one of our core values as well is maintaining affordable rentals for people, and avoiding those rent evictions for while moving to higher performance buildings is a critical part of our strategy as well, right? So the other side of it maybe is some of the benefits that the people in those places get to see from the high performance retrofits.
Makes sense.
Kirk, I saw you were.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of chime in and say that, and I'm going to turn down my volume here so there's no feedback. There we go. So basically, I wanted to say that there's right now a VUCA situation that's happening. It's volatile, things are uncertain, there's sort of very complex maneuvers happening at the policy and the business level, and really what we're hearing is somewhat ambiguous. I keep on hearing people comparing 2022 to 2007, 2008, and so we have the best of times in terms of where we're at in terms of political sentiment and technology advancement and environmental imperatives and economic drivers. But also there's all this chaos that's happening around us, and we have to be mindful of that. Like, people are making investment decisions in a very complex world. And so it's not clear to them exactly what needs to happen and where to go, and even indeed what the payoffs and the end results are.
Fair enough. Is that a lack of awareness then for some of those older buildings, maybe not being led by, people who are as focused on the environment?
Yeah, maybe I'd add in too that I think there's a lot of big property owners that have large portfolio of buildings and are thinking about this in very advanced ways. A lot of our buildings across the city are smaller, mid-tier buildings, that might not have the same resources to be able to tackle the problem. So one of the biggest things we get coming into our navigation program is building owners looking for, what should I do? So they know they want to do something, whether it be save costs through improving efficiency or maybe sustainability goals, but they don't actually know how to do it. So providing that integrated retrofit support is absolutely necessary, because the knowledge of what to do is one of the biggest barriers as well. The technology exists, but how do you actually implement that? That's a huge struggle.
For sure. Shannon, I see you nodding there. Would you like to add?
Well, I guess I know we're coming to this a little later as well, but on this exact topic of barriers and talking about improving the electrical grid as well. So I'm in Edmonton, and we often hear about all the improvements that are happening on the east side of the country, but because our grid right now it is mostly still fossil fuel based, that it's a little bit of like the chicken and the egg. Like, do we just start making these retrofits more towards electricity, and we kind of just move that along and get the signal to our providers that that's what we're going towards, or do we wait until the infrastructure is there to get those going? So I think that is a question, and I think it's not a clear answer yet, but it's an interesting one for Alberta.
Yeah, and in the Toronto context, I won't assume to be the expert here, but I'd say that electric is the only path where you have that potential to be clean. So that should be a guiding principle. I know the federal government as well has provided some grant money to electricity system operators to try to decarbonize as well. So I think we're starting on the right trajectory, and I think at least planning to be able to move to electric, even if it's not electric today in those jurisdictions, making sure you have low temperature distribution system for heat so that you can move to an electric heat pump. Otherwise, there's the danger of not being able to be cost competitive anymore in the future as the bigger transition happens.
Sure. Kirk, did you want to jump in? I thought that.
Yeah, I wanted to, I'll turn off the thing there. Okay. I wanted to state that I mentioned before that it's a very chaotic time and it's a VUCA situation, but I also wanted to say that back in 2008 to 2010, I was at the City of Toronto working on, all of these programs for the first time, Tower Renewal, Green Standard. And those were for the people that invested during those very turbulent times. They can look back right now and say they made some very smart, very accretive decisions that paid off very well for them in the future. So early adopters do benefit, especially in these chaotic times. So don't be deterred by all the churn, plow forward and have a clear vision and understand what the situation is on the ground, and be very clear going forward and exercise some agility in that, which is VUCA Prime for all those MBA students out there. So VUCA is the problem, but VUCA Prime is the solution.
That's great. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the obstacles, and we've talked about obviously awareness as well. Can we focus a little bit on why it's important for policymakers and building owners to understand the potential for carbon? I noticed we have a question as well about this. So I'll just go with our lead question, and then we can tack that on too. So the owners to understand the potential for carbon reductions and energy savings, as well as the cost of building retrofits before developing policy or making investment decisions. So why is it important for everyone to understand this before we can go ahead and obviously make the decisions? I mean, seems clear, but I'm sure you guys can add a little bit more detail to that. Mike, I'm gonna lead with you on this one here.
Sure. It's absolutely critical to, I'll say it this way, is do your homework and understand the real benefits behind it. And quite often it may be looking very shiny, but it really has not that big of an impact. And when Devon talks about what sort of energy use, is it clean to come in and what do you do? And I think those are all important questions that have to be answered. And I think it is the other piece of it is when you're putting policy in it, it quite often does not reflect the market conditions of what's happening out there. The one example that comes to mind is, and I think it's in the preamble there, that, we can reduce, large building sector emissions by 21.2 million tons of CO2 by 2030. Mm-hmm. So you take that into perspective and you said, okay, well, that sounds awesome. But the reality is that even possible? So, I mean, that essentially means there's about out of those 100,000, so you backdate that 8 years. And you go, okay, that means we have to complete 35 of those large building projects each and every single day, 365 days a year from now till then. So I think the realisticness to putting in policies really does need to say, is this achievable? And I think we have to be very cognizant of the policies that are being put in place, that you have to achieve it, and can you achieve it? And that alone, if it'll be another question down the line here, is just, do you have the availability of the workforce to even do this this grand of scale of work in the time frame that they're suggesting? Maybe I'll add one other piece to that, is that it is super important to gauge, we'll say, all stakeholders, and I'll touch on this later too. Is quite often we miss certain, we'll say, groups that can provide the value. So I think it's important to get the perspectives of all facets of, we'll say, the policy, or where they want to go with respect to the reduction of the decarbonization.
Okay. Go ahead, Kirk.
Yeah. So I want to present a view that recognizes the steepness of that target, but I also want to motivate people, and I'm going to pull something from the great Andrew McCallum, who used to run Oxford. And one of his stories, which really got the whole LEED and the sustainability drive thing moving, was when they started introducing air conditioning to the marketplace in the commercial real estate. It took less than 10 years for almost every single Class A equivalent building to switch from no AC to AC. So when there's the proper amount of incentives and drivers, so market mechanisms, government incentives, regulatory push, and accelerators, because you need to get people to activate and accelerate these things. When all those things work in concert, you can get some amazing things happening. But absolutely, it is a super daunting challenge, and we're going to need everybody on board for this.
Fair enough. Shannon or Devon?
Yeah, I was just thinking about some of the, there's many programs. So within Alberta, I can speak to my experience here, is that with Alberta municipalities, they've got a number of programs set up for residential and commercial buildings to do retrofits, and then within City of Edmonton, there's also programs, and I see how it takes many different associations. It takes the professionals in the industry. It takes policymakers. It takes program administrators. It's a complex relationship, but I see how it can work, and that right now specifically, everyone's on board for making these changes, and I feel like it's a very encouraging time, because everyone's just I have this sense that we're waiting for the right mix to happen, and everyone's ready to jump on board if it makes sense. And I think it's starting to gel that way between policymakers, professionals, industry leaders. So I'm encouraged with where the market's going right now, just because I have this sense that we're kind of at that tipping point.
Yeah, I'd say that the level of action required is absolutely ambitious, right? To echo what Mike was saying as well, it's the scale. Toronto has 500,000 buildings that need to be retrofit to meet our 2040 target. So, just thinking about how many buildings need to be completed per day, per month, it means that there's an absolutely huge uptick in workforce and supply chain that needs to be driven to accomplish this. Now, there's some huge potential economic benefits to delivering that locally as well. And I think there's an opportunity for entrepreneurs to step up, companies to step up and expand their service offerings. The other big part of it is life cycle analysis, and we're working towards that tipping point. So, one exciting thing on the residential side here, this year, because of the increasing cost of natural gas and the big increase we've gone through very recently, it means this is the first year it would be cheaper to heat my house with a heat pump than a gas furnace in Toronto. That is incredible, incredible. And, I think we were expecting this later in the decade before. It's moved up. All right. And actually looking at those life cycle costs is critical to saying, what can you do with your retrofit? Can you move that up? Does it make sense? And, that's changing for a lot of buildings. Beyond just residential, Class A electricity customers here definitely have an opportunity where they have low peak energy costs through the winter. They have an opportunity as well to decarbonize now cost effectively, right?
Maybe I can just add one piece to that, and I don't want to be the downer of the great optimism of this great ambitious goal, and I absolutely am behind it and in favor of it as well. And I'm going to bring from our perspective, or from my perspective, in the construction industry and what the labor market is like today and what it's going to be for the next foreseeable future. Certainly in the next, what we see is in the next 3 to 5 years,
right,
it's going to be very, very challenging. So to hit the goals, what I would suggest, and when you look at the policymakers and when we're looking at is which areas are the most impactful and where can individuals make the most impact, and prioritization, I think, will be absolutely critical with respect to policy and where you're going to make the biggest bang for the buck, because we're not going to be able to do it all. And it is a very, I won't say bleak. I'm an optimistic person, but I think the labor market is going to be tremendously challenging, along with supply chain for the next little while.
Thank you for that. All right, we do have a question from our audience here. Let's go to that. If price of carbon is less than cost of retrofits and implementing net zero measures, will carbon credit purchases by building owners be the easiest way to achieve end result? That's a good question, big question. Kirk he's smiling. Do you want to tackle that?
Sure. I think that it is a fast way, but make sure that you've got solid carbon, not greenwashy carbon credits. Make sure that the stuff is maybe preferably, or Canadian based or something along those lines. Like, try and make sure that the quality of those carbon credits is quite well and sound. But honestly, what you're doing is you're delaying your investment in your own infrastructure. If you eventually have to make that investment, why not do it now? Why take this year's carbon credit payment and just give it to somebody else when you can actually invest it in improving your heating, your HVAC, your ventilation, or something along those lines? It's fast and easy, but you'll probably regret it and think it was wasted money downstream. Now, let me add that if you do everything and you still have something left, then you top it off with carbon credits. That's a very sound strategy, and that's what smart money is doing. So do it at the very end. Don't do it at the beginning to avoid spending the money.
Did you want to add to that, Devon?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd say 100%. We're seeing that, if you make those improvements to your building now, you will also get other benefits from it. So when you think about occupant comfort, you think about better ventilation leading to healthier buildings. When you think about in the commercial towers sector, that sustainability requirement to attract the best tenants. There's a variety of other benefits to retrofitting your own buildings now. I'd be cautious, again, as same reason as Kirk, about those credits that are available. You know, some can be good, but you have to be very careful where you invest. And you know, often when you're looking at low cost credits, they may not be the best investment. The other thing we really need for our buildings as well is that in order to limit our investment in the overall electricity system, you know, we really need buildings to reduce peak demand. So it makes sense to be investing in buildings rather than credits that may not impact our local systems.
Great, thank you. We have another question here too. I think while we're at it, we'll tackle this one too, and then we'll move back to our program, our regularly scheduled program. Should investors and building owners take a carbon shadow price, internal price of carbon into their investment considerations, which would lower, I think this is ROI on first glance, but better future-proof such investments? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say 100%. You need to be factoring in that increasing cost of carbon. You know, on the world stage, I think this is something that's going to be around for a long time. You know, the direction that we're seeing is that we're going to have a carbon price. You know, beyond 2030 and what the federal government has announced of $170 a ton right now, do I expect it to keep increasing beyond this? Probably. And like any investment decision, you should be doing a discounted cash flow analysis to you know, incorporate all of the life cycle costs. And once you do that, that shadow price makes a huge amount of sense to include in your decision-making process. Kirk, I'm sure you're adding to this.
Oh, absolutely. But you know, basically what Devon said, right? Having a like Infrastructure Ontario uses it. All of the larger players have some number that they've set aside, whether it's $100, $175. You know, can include a number and add an escalation factor if you're doing it on the low side, because same as we carry the escalation costs for electricity and other fuels, this is something that you need to carry because it's going to impact you eventually. And as we start seeing the effects of climate change and extreme weather, those things are going to come hit us sooner rather than later. So the other thing I'd also say is start not just only increase or include a number for carbon, but also carry a number for resilience. A lot of these changes to net zero also build in a substantial amount of resilience, and there's a risk that you're avoiding by doing that, and that should be baked into your analysis, right? So just include the risk rewards that you get by going net zero.
Great. All right, let's move back to our program here. Not every building is the same, which I think we've talked about a little bit, and not every project's the same. Certainly, we don't have all the resources for everything today necessarily. What are some of the different approaches to deep carbon retrofits for different building archetypes? And I know we talked about this a little bit previous to our call today. Maybe, Kirk, could you start out by explaining for us what that means in terms of building archetypes, and then
yeah, no problem.
A little bit about the different types of approaches.
Okay. So when we consider commercial real estate, you've got your standard sectors, you've got multifamily, you've got institutional, you've got office, retail, etc. So those are your sectors. And then if we go into something like multifamily, you would have a post-war archetype. You would have a built 2000 onwards archetype. You'd have a mid-rise archetype. Look at your portfolio and try and find the top 5 kind of building profiles that you've got, and those would be the archetypes that you would use, right? So that's it from an archetype conversation. To answer your question on what is the meta strategy, if you will, to kind of embark on a deep carbon or a net zero strategy, NRCan has put together some excellent major energy retrofit guidelines, and then they break it down by sector and building type. So there's some really good advice and guidance on that. If I want to give a followable strategy, just use Kirk's, you know, I always do acronyms. So activate, right? So A, accelerate your targets and timelines. C, create your dream teams that are going to work on it. T, start tracking and benchmarking your carbon, your costs, your consumption, and things like that. I invest in your workforce, all right? And let's see here. V, as I said earlier, value, risk, and resiliency. A, align the interests and all the intersections, because we have all these utilities and municipalities and federal and association, all these carbon accelerators, all of that stuff, start incorporating that. And then T, trigger the actual projects, right? Like we have all these great strategies, but you actually have to trigger the stuff. And when you're doing that, have some inclusive and whole life evaluations. Don't just go on payback, go on whole life, go on inclusive evaluations, make your ESG kind of rubric part of those decisions. And the last thing on Activate is E, which is engage your stakeholders, right? They will give you some amazing ideas and excellent feedback and probably give you the justification you need to move it up the ladder and get a green light with that extra zero in your budget.
Awesome. Mike, from a contractor's perspective, have you had an opportunity to work on a number of different approaches in terms of these retrofits, or are you seeing kind of a blanket approach across the board?
Maybe I'll answer it this way, is that I think every building is going to be a bit unique, right? So every building is going to have a different comfort need, if you will, whether it's through temperature or HVAC. So everything, like a hospital is going to be different than a warehouse. And,
right.
You know, and when you look at each of those things, I think you got to look at the building type from there. And then I think the other approach that usually I know that we look at is not just you can't look at it in a single approach, like we're just going to fix the envelope. You have to look at it holistically. And because you may not need to upgrade your envelope when actually if you just change your HVAC system, you might actually achieve the reduction that you need. Same thing from the water supply. And I know Devon touched on you know, different types of heat pumps and those types of things. So I think when you look at it holistically for each unique building and treat each building uniquely, then I think you can find the right solution.
Great. Devon or Shannon, did you want to add anything? Or?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would 100% echo that integrated design philosophy where you have to look at the building as a whole to get where you need to go. You know, one of the examples we look at in our strategy is, so if you are retrofitting to a heat pump and you make those envelope improvements to the building, you might not have to increase the size of your distribution pipes to move to a low temperature heat distribution system. So looking at that holistically, the other part is, you know, what's above business as planned. So you're planning to replace your windows in 5 years with like for like similar double pane windows to what you have now. What's that incremental cost? So can you install something a bit better? And what's the incremental payback? I think that's really important to look at as well. The one other thing I'd say about archetypes and how you cluster buildings, we also like to look at clustering buildings based on what retrofits need to be done. So you can also lump them together, not just in their current state, but in what you need to do to them, which sort of comes from the current state, but it's valuable to think about both when you're putting it together.
Perfect. We have a couple more questions here from our audience, so let's hop on those. What are your thoughts on hybrid solutions? For example, when combined with smart controls, dual fuel hybrid systems that pair traditional natural gas furnaces with heat pumps are estimated to reduce emissions by up to 2/3 at an extra cost of less than $3,000 for an average home compared to a conventional system. I know this is a little bit like we were talking with heat pumps and stuff. Devon's smiling. Do you want to?
I'm happy to touch this in the Toronto context. I definitely will say maybe it does not apply to the plans Canada-wide, but you know, I would say, you know, those hybrid systems have been a great transition technology. However, Toronto is in at least a very good spot for going full heat pump conversion, really. Our design temperature is only -13 downtown, right? So you can get a heat pump that runs efficiently across all of the winter weather that we see here. And it makes sense to go all the way in order to hit our 2040 target. You know, I know we engage with other municipalities. some that are much more northerly than us. And, you know, part of their plan is to have that hybrid system, you know, for the coldest weather days. You know, I think anyway, some of that is absolutely necessary, but you know, in our context where it's warm enough to go all heat pump, I think that's a slam dunk.
Makes sense. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Shannon.
Oh, sorry. I was going to add to that. Yeah. So for our colder climate, so we've got the cold climate heat pumps now, and a lot of homeowners. So my work is mostly with residential, but I can imagine how this applies for larger buildings as well. That, yeah, if you're looking to make that transition, but the cost isn't quite there yet, you can get into place. Like say if you have an air conditioner already and it needs to be replaced, or you're looking at getting an air conditioner, you could go for a heat pump, have your backup furnace there already, and then when that furnace needs to be replaced, or it comes to the end of its life cycle, or we are actually at that point where electricity is more cost effective than natural gas, then you've got that heat pump there ready to go as your. So, and of course that depends on sizing and everything as well. So there's lots of considerations there. But right now, if someone's looking to make the transition right now, I think having that as having the natural gas furnace as a backup for those extra cold days is definitely worth it. And as the price changes, then you can be relying more heavily on that heat pump.
Yeah, maybe I could add just a little bit to that as well, where one of the big things in residential as well is when do people replace their furnaces? Often it's an emergency replacement scenario where it's died, you need some heat, and it's difficult to get an electrical service installed, get a heat pump that right now is back ordered. So, you know, those hybrid systems might be a good solution to reduce your emissions there as well, where you end up being, you know, putting in a like-for-like furnace, but, you know, you can replace that air conditioning unit with a heat pump and, you know, have that great pathway, you know, for the transition.
All right. I have a question for Mike here, I think. At least you can start us out. So from the construction side, what are builders and constructors doing to contribute to net zero, i.e. changes in materials, on-site processes, equipment, fuels, and that kind of stuff?
Sure. So we've been doing actually a lot for probably even over the last 20 years. So it's been a progress, you know, obviously from waste, just pure waste reduction, energy usage, using more efficient heat. But probably one of the things that we've used more in the last probably 5 years that we're seeing a nice difference is our sensors, so IoT sensors. And that's been a pretty impactful. So picture a couple of really, I think, ones that have moved the needle for us is when we're building towers, and certainly in the winter months of Canada, you got to heat the forms as you're pouring the slabs, and that heat's got to stay in place. So when you have temperature regulations, you got sensors that are put in the area. You can actually self-regulate and only put the temperature at the needed heat. And actually, we found great reduction in gas use and energy consumption. In addition to that, even sensors within the concrete to get it to the proper strength, so we can actually strip earlier as opposed to the standard 7-day. A lot of times, we're actually able to strip down in 5 days, and sometimes it's 3 days down to 2 days. So just that, when you're able to do that, that means that your actual heat can come down as well, or help heat usage. So when you're doing the heat and hort, that's one of the areas. You know, electrical, you know, we're obviously the LED switch, we've done lots of those things. So just and motion sensors as well with respect to when people go into certain places. So I think just overall, those are a lot of the things that we're seeing. One of the things that we are recognizing is that we say technology and innovation with respect to concrete is another one, finding because it is a big you know, decarbonization, or lots of carbon comes out of just the production of the cement and the concrete. So, you know, we'll say reduction of, you know, the decarbonization efforts in concrete supply and finding different ways to do that. So there's lots of innovative ways and lots of organizations that are going down that path from a material perspective. Even if you look at some of the, I think it's extruded polystyrene is, you know, considerably higher than the different types of insulation that's being used. So I think a lot and this is more in the last 2 to 5 years, or even in the last 6 months, it's really nice to see that there's lots of different innovation just from the material. So you look at the embodied carbon from new structures, we're certainly seeing great efforts being made to reduce those. And in some cases we got to, and again, there's a balance to all of that, because when you look at the different types of low carbon concrete, there is a premium to it. And so it is the balance of, okay, what's the premium? And like everything else, the price will go down over time. And I'll use solar panels as a great example of that. Solar panels used to be astronomically high and very expensive, and just, unless you're getting massive subsidies to go build these. But today they're actually, they're net cost good, just as is. So things have worked really. Timing is good. I'm in a hotel and the fire alarm is going off. So
of course it is.
So maybe I'll stop there and put me on mute.
Good luck with that. All right.
If you have to get up and go.
Yeah, let us know. Don't don't wait to the last second. All right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit. Talk a bit about policy and some of the actions to accelerate the uptake of retrofit measures. So, looking at my notes, I'm reminded that the City of Toronto recently recommended actions such as requiring annual performance reporting, providing support for financing and funding, and building awareness so owners have the information they need to make good decisions. How can these and other policies and actions help to affect that transformation towards zero emissions in existing buildings? And Devon, of course, I'm going to pick on you because you're with the City of Toronto. So,
of course.
Yes, and we're going to keep an eye on Mike and make sure he's okay there at the same time.
Well, I'm not going to try to give too many people any heart attacks, but I think the direction we're headed with this. So we had in June 2021 our net zero existing building strategy come out and outline the actions we think we need to take to get to net zero. So I'd break it down into 3 areas. The first one being around data reporting and labeling. So we're talking about expanding the disclosure of energy data for buildings. So Ontario has the energy water benchmarking and reporting framework where large buildings are required to report. We want to expand that into smaller buildings. We want to have single family homes report too, through a different mechanism, which will be easier for them. But looking at that, you also look into things like the labeling aspect. So if you're buying or selling a building, understanding the energy use of that building is a critical part to what your decision-making process should be, right? So some of that policy will, so that's the data side. Out of that data as well, you're looking at people to go and do continuous audits of their building energy use. So you can understand what you're using in your building and rectify that. If there's a problem, make improvements, make the right decisions, right? Similarly to recommissioning, systems need to be looked at again. Your building automation system, you need to come back to it and actually look at what are the settings. When we made this temporary change, did it revert back to the regular settings, right? That recommissioning, retro commissioning part is absolutely critical to ensure your building's operating as it should be. Right, so having a requirement there is part of the picture, and maybe the biggest part of this is for the potential for emissions performance requirements. So mandating that a building can only emit so much carbon, and beyond that, this hasn't been fleshed out for Toronto, but it is in our plan. So our plan is to introduce voluntary emissions performance targets, which will transition to mandatory later in the decade. And, that's a signal to building owners that they should be looking at this transition now. So an example is New York City, who has already introduced these emissions performance requirements, and they have big penalties attached to not meeting them, right? So it's happening. It's happening. The other part of our strategy is supporting these retrofits. So I think I mentioned earlier that people don't always know what to do, how to get to net zero. So providing that integrated retrofit support to provide guidance on how to get there is absolutely critical. And same as incentives and financing to offset the costs for those retrofits. And, you know, finally, some of the advocacy to other levels of government, some of the workforce development, supply chain development, all required as part of the big picture.
Go for it, Kirk. I think you have something to add
Yep.
there.
Absolutely. I can see that. Your light up microphone.
I love
the
it.
light up microphone. Love it. So voluntary standards always precede mandatory standards. And like I said earlier, there's actually a study that somebody did to say, what is the effect of people and industries and sector and all stakeholders by embracing voluntary standards? They looked at it, and the best time to get involved is just before those standards kick in. So right now, basically, because the lead times for you to go from, hey, I want to participate in the program, to actually doing it is quite a bit of time. So if you start now and you get into those voluntary standards with all the incentives, because we want to show that it can be done in each of the archetypes and all of the sectors, there's a lot of help available to you. Once it flips over to mandatory, it's up to you. You gotta meet it, right? And that was our experience with Toronto Green Standard and everything else on that. So I would say follow that line of logic and embrace this, because this is something that's already in place in New York, and Toronto is doing it, but it's going to spread across Canada. So that's the wave that's coming, and get out your surfboards.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I mean, I love everything you guys are saying, because it is happening. I think that's something maybe people don't realize, that like these programs already exist as voluntary programs potentially. So if you have, if you have a building, or you're a stakeholder in this, you can encourage your building owners or whoever's operating the building to start paying attention to the bill, start looking at your energy consumption, and look to see where you can report. Because what they're finding too in Edmonton, they're finding that just by having the awareness, just by doing that work of reporting every year, they're already making choices just from being aware to reduce their energy consumption. So they're seeing across the board 3.5% energy savings per year just by reporting. So that awareness is a huge part of it. And like you said, it's coming. It's going to be mandatory in the future. So may as well start now and get those policies in place within your organization to keep track and make those decisions with that information.
Great. Before we move on to the next question, just a reminder, our attendees, we have a couple of poll questions down on the right. Right now, you see there's a number 2 next to that. Be sure to check those out and cast your votes as well. And we'll shift along. So preventing heat loss by improving the building envelope and converting to more efficient electric heating systems are some of the more well-known ways of meeting net zero goals. But can you share with us some other key technical components of a deep retrofit strategy? I think we have a different level of knowledge and familiarity today in our audience. And I think it would be great just to get a little bit more perspective. And Shannon, I'm going to pick on you to keep chatting.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my background is an energy advisor. So the commercial equivalent of that would be an energy auditor, certified energy auditor, usually through like an ASHRAE 1 or 2 level audit. So what these professions can do is they come in and like Devon was talking about, really giving an awareness of what's required to improve your building if it's an existing building. So there's so many ways you can improve a building, and a lot of people are really attracted to the sexy technologies like heat pumps or solar, for example. But as we've kind of mentioned, it's a holistic view of your building. So looking at the building envelope is one really key way, because so much heat is lost through the building envelope, and you can waste, upgrades. You can waste so much money doing upgrades when really you could actually be shrinking your system if you improve your building envelope. So just learning these things about the technology of or the science of how buildings work and stack effect, especially for those taller buildings. You really want to make sure you've got really good insulation going on, and ventilation. So what more to say about that? Just that. I hope you're okay over there. just making sure that, before you go ahead and look at resizing your mechanical system, or if any policies are coming about resizing mechanical systems, don't go for that right away. First, look at how else you can improve your building envelope. And then actually you'll probably end up shrinking, saving a lot of money if you're able to shrink the size of your mechanical system. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that at the moment.
Okay, go ahead, Kirk. I think you've tapped in. I love it.
Tapped in. Yeah, so to build on what Shannon was saying, look at it through, I call it you want to live the dream. We all want to live that dream of decarbonization. So Kirk and his acronyms, right? So decarbonization, D, R for resiliency, E for electrification, A for automation, and then M for market value, right? So have a cross-functional team when you're looking at these big changes. These are massive investments, right? And if you only look at it through a decarbonization lens, you might leave some money on the table. If you don't include resiliency, you're not addressing the risk elements and the risk benefits of it. Electrification is going to bring so many revenue opportunities as it relates to smart grid for people that embrace it. And so when you're deciding what to do with your deep retrofits and addressing heat loss with heat pumps and insulation upgrades and stuff like that, make sure that the electrification and smart grid angle is addressed. And lastly, the items on analytics and automation. There's so many amazing technologies and platforms out there that allow you to do so much more. Most people don't even know what's possible right now, right? So sort of get your team out there and take on some new ideas, and have somebody in the room that's going to say, what is this going to do to the value of the building or the viability of the building? Because they might give you all the ammo you need, right? Like if you're looking at it from a asset manager market valuation perspective, I've been in meetings in situations where someone said, just by improving the savings, this will improve the asset value of the building. Forget about the paybacks. We're going to sell this building in 10 years. This is going to be a huge bump for us. And forget about the carbon, forget about the savings. Just on evaluation alone, it makes a ton of sense, right? And especially if we're looking at multifamily, whenever you do these big upgrades, you're probably going to start putting in air conditioning in buildings that might not have had it. And that's a big bump in terms of the people that live in it and the value of your building as well. So don't just look at it through one lens of how do we save carbon. It's how do we save carbon, improve resiliency, electrify the grid, embrace automation to leverage revenues and also improve the value of the building. Okay.
How are you doing over there, Mike?
I'm good.
Oh.
So maybe I'll chime in because it just
go for it. Will you get quiet?
I would just say controls technology, and I think Kirk touched on it already, but we're seeing as one of those, and it really dovetails in the comment that I had before, which was IoT sensors. Sensors are really out there, and when you can put the right sensors in your mechanical systems, there's a great opportunity on lots and lots of buildings to really optimize the efficiencies of each of the pieces of equipment. We've seen that's probably the easiest and simplest and most effective way of reducing the energy consumption in existing buildings.
Makes sense. Go ahead, Devon.
Sorry, 100%. And building on that, you've got to think about your occupancy. So the occupancy-based controls now with a lot of work from home, you've got to think about as well. How do you reduce ventilation, or what do you change when buildings are not occupied? So controls become important. We've seen lots of spaces as well where things like demand control ventilation. Where individual offices or individual rooms or areas can have the ventilation going to them varied. Things like that can make a big difference. You come back to other parts of retrofits, completely different as well, where we talk about more energy recovery. You have a data center in your building, you should be recovering that energy if you can, right? Drain heat recovery. You look at even heat recovery for ventilation. Huge. That's all outside of the envelope, and kind of related to the envelope as well. And low-hanging fruit is usually air sealing as well, right? Which makes a huge difference. When we talk about envelope as well, one of the other big ones that's not directly insulation or windows is the thermal bridging part as well, right? So trying to make sure you're not putting thermal pathways through your new insulation, bringing that cold in, right? So important to think about that as well.
Yeah, another thing to add to that, Devon, too, is like the penetrations. Like when you're doing retrofits, it's so easy to have so many different contractors in there, and there's penetrations going through the wall, and that's where that thermal bridging happens, air leakage happens. So yeah, just like making sure that you've got the understanding between your contractors, or you've got someone on it all the time just watching where these things are happening.
Great. All right, so we are down to our final 5 minutes. I don't know how that went so quick, but it did. So what I'd like to do is give each of you a moment to share final thought. If there's a report or a resource that you think would be useful, what I've noticed came up in this conversation a couple of times, Devon, you mentioned especially, was a lot of building owners don't know where to start. So, I mean, maybe with that prospect in mind, where should they start, right? So perhaps part of your final thought could be resources in that sense too. So I'm going to go clockwise. So that means I get to start with you, Kirk.
Oh, me. Okay. All right. So just to recap, I'm at my acronym limit, right? So I'll recap by saying, if you want to live that dream, right, decarbonization, resiliency, et cetera, activate ESG, environmental, social governance. That is your pathway and your leverage to get those budgets approved, right? And in terms of resources that you've got, NRCan has some great retrofit guides for those that want to get started, and go to Efficiency Canada, and they've done a lot of work on development in those areas, and you'll get a sense of what the pulse is and where things are going there.
Great. Thank you. Mike, you're up next.
Okay. And I'll give the perspective more from the contracting side of things, is really prioritize your action, whatever it may be. As I've alluded to it earlier, the labor market and the contracting community is extremely busy. So if you got some low-hanging fruit that doesn't require, supply chain or lots of intensive labor, hit those first would be the suggestion. But if you are embarking on a large labor-intensive retrofit, then you really got to understand and consider what the market is out there today and for the next 3 years, 5 years, as I said. So that's what I see, and that's probably going to be the biggest stumbling block for us achieving this aggressive goal, if you will.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad you're okay over there. Shannon, you're up next.
Okay, I guess I would just say, in addition to what's already been said, that to participate. So participate with wherever you are at right now. Start to lean in, because we're going in the direction where it's going to be mandated to participate. So may as well just start now. And if you are in the industry side of things, like Mike, to give your feedback and stay involved in the conversation. And yeah, if you're a stakeholder, then see what you can do to be involved in the process. So like attending this event is a great start.
Great, thank you. All right, Devon, bring us home. No pressure.
Well, I think I have a lot to offer here as well. So I think if you're looking for this guidance and you're in Toronto, at least, you should reach out to me and my team, bbp@toronto.ca or toronto.ca/bbp. Through our programs, we can offer that guidance on how to get to net zero. We can offer financing for projects. We run a collaboration program for the Green Will Initiative for large property owners to bring them together, provide training, provide collaboration opportunities. The financing for deeper retrofits. We're running the Deep Retrofit Challenge program right now as well. Providing incentives, and which will lead to some case studies and knowledge dissemination. And both on the side of those building owners and on the side of builders, engineering consultants, architects, also come to us with your projects. We'll help to convince your clients that that's the right way to go if you need it. And the financing can be really, really lucrative in this rising rate environment. Right.
That's great. Thank you. Well, that's all the time we've got. So a big thank you to all of our panelists. Give them your virtual applause in our chat box there. We wouldn't be able to host important discussions like this one without the generous support of our industry partners. So thank you again to our partner PCL for sponsoring today's webinar. Last but not least, a big thank you goes out to all our attendees. Your participation through the chat and through poll questions really helped to drive a level of intimacy that wouldn't otherwise be possible. If you follow Actual Media up at the top of your screen, you'll automatically get a notification for the latest information on upcoming webinars. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's session, or if you have an idea for future webinar topics, we also encourage you to share those with us too. So thank you again, stay safe, and we will see you in the new year.